Imagine sitting on death row for nearly 20 years for a crime you didn't commit. And during your trial, you watch silently as police and prosecutors knowingly presented false testimony and evidence to a jury fully aware it could take away your life. And all the while, you're thinking there's no way the jury could believe any of it because none of it's true. Yet, ultimately, you're convicted of murder. And for the next 2 decades, different lawyers keep filing appeal after appeal, begging the state to turn over evidence that you were legally entitled to at the time of your trial, only to be told again and again that the evidence didn't exist. But then, as the years pass, and with each new appeal, tiny fragments of truth finally start to surface. Small snippets of information slowly handed over, piece by piece. And they begin to form a bigger picture, evidence that could have changed everything over 20 years ago when it mattered the most. Seems crazy to think about. Seems far-fetched even. But that is exactly what the LA Innocence Project is claiming happened in the infamous case of Scott Peterson. And now, after 2 decades of fighting to obtain the evidence he was legally entitled to, Scott's lawyers believe they've uncovered things that could crack this case wide open and possibly overturn his entire conviction. So let's get into the new 2025 updates in the Scott Peterson case. But before we dive into the latest developments, let's take a brief step back and revisit the case that captivated the nation. Because to understand why this new evidence matters, we need to first understand how we got here. Scott told police he had gone fishing in the afternoon of Christmas Eve, December 24th, 2002, at the Berkeley Marina in San Francisco Bay. He claimed that when he returned home, 3 things immediately struck him as strange. The family dog was in the backyard with his leash still on, the back door was unlocked, and his wife Laci, who was 7.5 months pregnant, wasn't home, even though, according to Scott, they were supposed to leave at around 4 p.m. to go to her mother's house for Christmas Eve dinner. Scott said he called Laci several times throughout the day on her cell phone and the home landline, but he never got an answer. Because he was running late, he claimed he assumed her mother may have picked her up early to help with dinner preparations, something that he said wouldn't have been unusual on Christmas Eve since they lived down the street from each other. But when Scott played the messages on their answering machine, he said he was alarmed to hear a recent message from Laci's stepfather asking him and Laci to bring over whipped cream when they came, realizing that meant that Laci wasn't there after all. Scott claimed he then immediately called his mother-in-law, and when she confirmed that Laci wasn't there, he told her it was strange because her car was home and the lights were off and the dog was in the backyard with his leash still on. But Laci was nowhere to be found. Laci's mother then urged Scott to call Laci's friends while she and her partner Ron began calling hospitals and eventually 911. The case quickly drew national attention. Search efforts were massive, but many people thought Scott's behavior was strange, especially after the media learned of his recent affair with another woman, Amber Frey, and this fueled public suspicion. But from the very beginning, this case wasn't just about physical evidence, it was about perception. Families discussed it around the dinner table. Co-workers whispered about it at work. Neighbors speculated in their driveways. And almost everyone agreed on one thing. Scott Peterson obviously seemed guilty. The story dominated headlines and cable news cycles. Scott was painted as the cold, unfeeling, cheating husband who murdered his pregnant wife on Christmas Eve to start a new life with a single mom he had just met just weeks prior. But sadly, in April of 2003, the bodies of Laci and Connor were discovered on the shore of San Francisco Bay, not far from where Scott said he had been fishing, and Scott was arrested. As the case exploded further, even the president got involved. Then President George W. Bush referenced Laci's case while advocating for the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, later known as Laci and Connor's Law. Scott wasn't just on trial for murder, he had become a symbol in a heated national debate. By the time Scott's trial began, the narrative was already locked in place. The jury pool had been exposed to months of relentless coverage. The verdict, to much of the public, felt inevitable. Scott was sentenced to death, despite there being no eyewitnesses and no physical evidence linking him to the crime scene. The prosecution never proved when he did it or how he did it. They just told the jury they knew that he did it. Many believe the case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence and interpretations of his behavior. So Scott sat on death row for 15 years. Then in August of 2020, after years of back and forth appeals, the California Supreme Court reversed Scott's death penalty sentence, citing judicial misconduct. Specifically, that the trial judge had improperly dismissed jurors who expressed opposition to the death penalty on a questionnaire. His sentence was overturned, but his conviction remained intact. And 4 years later, on January 2024, the Los Angeles Innocence Project filed motions with the San Mateo Superior Court seeking post-conviction discovery and new DNA testing in Scott's case. Many people found this development shocking. Certainly, the Los Angeles Innocence Project must be some hack organization just trying to get press or views, because everyone knows Scott Peterson is guilty. However, the Los Angeles Innocence Project isn't just some small legal practice. They're affiliated with the National Innocence Project through the Innocence Network, and there are over 60 organizations worldwide working to free wrongfully convicted individuals. To date, it is the largest legal practice that has worked on the Peterson case, now digging deep into every single piece of evidence they can get their hands on. And almost exactly a year ago today, on October 7th, 2024, through the filings of the Los Angeles Innocence Project, Judge Elizabeth Hill sided with Peterson and his defense and ordered the prosecution to turn over roughly 45 pieces of evidence. Many of these items, she ruled, were potentially exculpatory, meaning they could have supported Scott's innocence and swayed the jury had they been disclosed at the time of trial. This was huge for the case, a clear validation that something was deeply wrong with many aspects of the original investigation and trial. One area of particular concern centered on a burglary that occurred across the street from the Peterson home around the same time frame that Laci Peterson disappeared. For nearly 2 decades, Scott's appeals have gone almost nowhere. But now, under the powerful direction of the Los Angeles Innocence Project, and with a judge finally siding with Peterson's defense and forcing the state to hand over this long-hidden evidence, new information seems to be surfacing at a rapid pace. Some of it is coming from witnesses, some coming from police files buried for years, and some through modern scientific advancements that didn't exist back in 2002. And now, with the recently filed Habeas petition, the Los Angeles Innocence Project is sharing with the judge and with the world what they have uncovered through that research, a trail of withheld evidence, false testimony, and misconduct that they say proves Scott Peterson never received a fair trial. Now, the question is this: what happens when a case that united families, coworkers, politicians, an entire nation begins to unravel? And what could or should a judge decide when faced with that truth? So just 6 weeks ago, from the time I'm filming this, the Los Angeles Innocence Project filed a massive 14-claim habeas corpus petition in San Mateo County, a legal filing designed to overturn Scott's conviction. A habeas petition is a powerful legal motion filed when new evidence emerges or when serious constitutional violations like suppressed evidence or misconduct are discovered. It's essentially saying to the court, this conviction is broken, and we're going to show you how and why, and justice demands that it be fixed. Under California law, the court has 60 days to respond, so that means by October 3rd, 2025, a few weeks from now, the judge must either request additional briefing, deny some or all of the claims outright, or issue an order to show cause, which would lead to a full evidentiary hearing, a major step toward a possible new trial. And this filing isn't small. It is over 650 pages, backed by 49 exhibits, including sworn declarations, expert reports, and newly discovered police files. And I have to tell you, I still work full-time. I'm a single mom as well. So we're going to take our time going through all of this. Now, I'm going to have to break this up into many parts, but for this episode, we'll just go over the 14 claims and the overview of each section. Now, one thing I want to highlight before we even dive into the claims is the fact that this filing comes at a very interesting time when trust in the Stanislaus County District Attorney's Office is already pretty badly damaged. That is because earlier this year, Stanislaus County, which is the same county that handled the Peterson case, settled a $22.5 million settlement in a separate high-profile case, the Frank Carson case, where they were accused of fabricating and destroying evidence. Meanwhile, the very same prosecutors involved in both of those cases came out of retirement to get paid a special rate to not pursue justice, but to fight against the Los Angeles Innocence Project in court, arguing that they shouldn't have to turn over key evidence in the Peterson case. The judge, however, disagreed with them on many points, forcing them to hand over about 45 pieces of potentially exculpatory evidence. Everything we're about to go over comes directly from that new research they were able to do based on that evidence that was handed over. And I have to say, I don't think she's going to be very thrilled with what was uncovered here, and you'll know why very soon. So now that I've set the stage, let's dive into the filing itself and break down what Scott's legal team uncovered. So it begins with an overview, and to paraphrase, it essentially says that the case against Scott Peterson was entirely circumstantial. The prosecution claimed that Scott killed Laci on December 23rd or 24th, 2002, transported her body using his truck and boat, and dumped it in the San Francisco Bay. Despite extensive searches, no physical or forensic evidence was found linking him to the crime. No signs of foul play in the home, truck, boat, warehouse, and no murder weapon, cement anchors, or direct evidence. The prosecution's case relied mainly on 3 experts: Dr. DeVore, who used outdated science to claim Connor died on December 23rd, Dr. Cheng, who theorized Laci's body originated where Scott fished without using actual tide current data, and Eloise Anderson, a scent dog handler who claimed her dog detected Laci's scent at the marina. Meanwhile, the defense argued Laci was alive when Scott left home, went for a walk with the dog, and was later abducted, possibly by burglars across the street, which was from the Medina burglary. However, in this filing, they're saying that new evidence shows the burglary happened on December 24th, not December 26th, that the prosecution claimed. More people were involved than just the 2 who confessed, including a 3rd burglar who saw Laci alive. The burglars were linked to a burned orange van seen near the scene. If Laci was alive during the burglary, Scott could not have killed her. The petition also alleges that police and prosecutors destroyed and suppressed exculpatory evidence just 2 weeks after Scott was arraigned, preventing the defense from presenting the full truth at the trial. So let's hop into this. Claim number 1. Don't hate me if I mess up some of these words. New scientific evidence, fetal biometry. New scientific evidence that was not available at the time of trial exonerates petitioner because it shows that Laci and Connor's most likely date of death was not until January 1st, 2003. Prosecution expert Dr. Gregory DeVore told the jury Connor's gestational age at the time of his death was exactly 33 weeks and 1 day, corresponding to a date of death on December 23, 2002. In reaching his opinion, Dr. DeVore relied on ultrasound technology and research that was conducted over 40 years ago in 1984. If Laci was killed on December 23rd, petitioner was the only person who reasonably could have killed her because they were at home alone together that night after Laci spoke to her mother at around 8 p.m. The prosecution told the jury in closing that Dr. DeVore's measurements show us and his testimony shows us that Connor died right around the time the prosecution said he did. Members of the jury publicly stated after the verdict that they found Dr. DeVore to be credible and relied on his testimony to convict Petitioner. Dr. Peter Dublé is an expert and leading authority on obstetric radiology, diagnostic radiology, and the use of ultrasound and gestational age assessment. As he explains in his declaration, recent national and multinational scientific longitudinal fetal growth studies published in peer-reviewed medical journals show that the science DeVore relied on to reach his opinion has now been superseded and rendered inaccurate and unreliable by more recent research and studies. These new studies developed more robust data and unified fetal growth charts that are more precise, widely used, and supersede the outdated 1984 formula that Dr. DeVore used to calculate Connor's date of death. As Dr. Dublé explains, the newly published longitudinal studies had cohorts of thousands of healthy pregnant women and were carried out over a period of years across populations, allowing researchers to amass substantial data sets and create far more reliable fetal growth charts than the 1984 study and formula Dr. DeVore relied on to reach his opinion. The new science shows that Laci and Connor were alive until sometime between December 28, 2002 and January 5, 2003, with a most likely date of death on January 1st, 2003, based on Connor's gestational age at the time of his death. The studies are Intergrowth-21st, National Institute for Child Health and Development, World Health Organization, and NICHD. None of the fetal growth charts or other data published in these recent studies supports Dr. DeVore's opinion that Connor died on December 23rd. Counsel interviewed Dr. DeVore in December 2024 and asked him whether these recent studies impact his opinion that Connor died on December 23rd, 2002. Dr. DeVore acknowledged that it would have been better if he'd had the NICHD 2022 study at the time he testified, and he shared new calculations he had made using the data and fetal growth charts from the NICHD study. Dr. DeVore's own calculations using the 2022 NHCID study put Connor's gestational age at the time of death at 34 weeks and 3 days, which corresponds to a date of death on January 2nd, 2003, and not, as the jury was told, on December 23rd, 2002. This new scientific evidence alone exonerates Petitioner and eviscerates the prosecution's entire theory of the case. There is no evidence supporting any theory that Petitioner could have or did commit these crimes on December 28th or after. This new scientific evidence is alone sufficient grounds for overturning the conviction in this case because it shows that the jury relied on false and unreliable scientific evidence to convict Petitioner, violating his right to due process, and lays bare the falsity of the other circumstantial evidence that the jury relied on to convict him. Okay, so that seemed pretty clear to me, but to summarize that in plain English, the LAIP is saying that the entire case against Scott started with the idea that Laci and her unborn son were killed on December 23rd. Now, that date made Scott more likely the only possible killer, right? Since they were home alone that night. However, new evidence, way more advanced than what existed back in 2002, it now shows that Connor's most likely date of death was actually January 1st, 2003. What is really key about their argument here is, again, the original prosecution's expert has admitted that these newer studies completely change his own calculations. So what's my opinion on this, and what do I think the judge might say about this claim? Well, here's the thing. If a judge accepts this new evidence and, the original trial expert agreeing with the new evidence, it completely does wreck the prosecution's timeline. Their whole case was built on Scott being the only person who could have possibly done it on the 23rd. And science now suggests that Connor was alive days later. It really suggests that somebody else had to be involved here because, as we all know by then, police were really on Peterson's ass. So personally, this one really feels pretty strong to me, mostly because of the original expert, agreeing and changing his mind. And this one is not only just a theory, it's, backed by actual research. So many times judges really tend to take that kind of evidence pretty seriously. So if this claim stands, it could be enough on its own to get Scott a new trial. Okay, so on to the next one. And this one is very interesting as well. It's more science. Claim number 2 is new scientific evidence. I don't know how to pronounce. I guess it's Delft 3D technology. That's how I'm going to say it. Don't come after me. Okay. New scientific technology that was not available at the time of trial shows that the jury relied on false evidence by prosecution expert Dr. Ralph Chang to convict petitioner. Dr. Chang told the jury that Connor's body landed at the recovery site where his remains were recovered because the body had been put in the bay, quote, right in the middle distance between Berkeley Marina and Brooks Island, precisely where petitioner fished on December 24th, 2002. Dr. Chang did not base his opinion on any actual historic wind, tide, or current data. Indeed, he stated he did not believe tidal currents played a role at all in the movement of the bodies in the water. Instead, he relied solely on derivative wind drift pattern data. The prosecution relied on Dr. Chang's testimony and hypothesis that Connor's original anchor point was where petitioner fished to argue in closing that if Dr. Chang was believed, quote, then that man's a murderer. It's as simple as that, end quote. Shown below is People's Exhibit 284 showing Dr. Chang's progressive vector diagram, where he plotted a backtracking course as to where he believed that Laci and Connor started from. Dr. Chang was unable to explain how Laci's body migrated from the original anchor location to where her remains were recovered at Point Isabel. The defense called no expert to refute Dr. Chang's hypothesis. Jurors publicly stated after the trial that they relied on Dr. Chang's opinion to convict petitioner. Dr. Russell Fegan is a professor at Texas A&M, a scientific researcher and an expert in bay estuarine and coastal ecology and engineering, including the movement of water and other substances in coastal areas. He built a hydrodynamic model using state-of-the-art, here it is again, Delft 3D flow technology that recreated three-dimensional flow phenomena using actual historical wind, tide, and freshwater inflow discharge data to test Dr. Chang's opinion. The Delft 3D modeling technology Dr. Fegan used has evolved considerably over the last 2 decades and was not available in its current version at the time of trial. Dr. Fegan dedicated over 300 hours to building and running a model to test Dr. Chang's hypothesis and opinions and to investigate the most likely point of origin for the bodies. Dr. Fegan's modeling shows that Dr. Chang's hypothesis was wrong. The three-dimensional flow phenomenon using actual historical wind, tide, and freshwater inflow discharge data shows that the water movement in that part of the bay is nearly always in a counterclockwise direction, circling Brooks Island in a northwesterly direction, meaning that an object located at Dr. Chang's hypothesized anchor point would not travel to Connor's recovery site. As the red line in the image above from Dr. Fegan's modeling shows, the path an object released at Dr. Chang's hypothesized anchor point would travel is in a counterclockwise direction, moving northwest and around Brooks Island, assuming that the object began migrating on the date and at the time Chang theorized it became unmoored. In other words, had Connor's body become unmoored at the location where petitioner fished, it would not have migrated to the location where his remains were discovered, as Dr. Cheng testified. Dr. Fegan then tested whether an object located at Dr. Cheng's anchor point would migrate to Connor's recovery site using actual wind and tide data from other possible dates and times. No scenario supported Dr. Cheng's hypothesis. The colored lines in the image below show the results of that modeling and illustrate that none of the alternate scenarios that Dr. Fegan ran resulted in an object at Cheng's anchor point, where Petitioner fished, migrating to either recovery site. This new scientific evidence shows that the jury relied on false evidence by Dr. Cheng that the highest probability of where Connor's body originated was, quote, right in the middle distance between Berkeley Marina and Brooks Island, end quote, precisely where Petitioner fished on December 24th, 2002. Dr. Fegan then ran Delft 3D simulations to determine the most likely anchor location using Connor's known discovery site and backtracking it over time, as Dr. Cheng did. But Dr. Fegan used actual measured historical water movement and real observed wind data. Dr. Fegan's analysis showed the body's most likely anchor point was in the waters south of Point Isabel in the Albany Bulb area, indicated by the green star below. The yellow line in the image above shows the path the bodies would take when backtracking the path from the recovery sites. The green star indicates the body's point of origin. The yellow star indicates Laci's recovery site, and the red star indicates Connor's recovery site. Dr. Fegan's analysis is supported by other evidence in the record. Jeffrey Baer was the head diver during multi-jurisdictional base search operations and efforts from late December 2002 through May 2003. He testified that the waters around the Albany Bulb could not be searched by divers because those waters were too shallow for the boats using sonar technology to enter. Dr. Fegan's modeling using state-of-the-art Delft 3D flow modeling technology shows that Dr. Cheng's hypothesis was wrong and that the body's most likely anchor point was in the small embayment in the Albany Bulb area just south of Point Isabel, where Laci's remains washed ashore, and not where Petitioner fished on December 24th, as the jury was told. The Albany Bulb is a peninsula formerly known as the Old Albany Landfill, which has been closed for a number of years, but had walking trails that go all the way around. It was open to all public, and people used that on a daily basis every single day. The photos below are from the East Shore State Park General Plan, published in December of 2002, and they show that the Albany Bulb provided numerous remote land access points from which a body could be put into the bay without the need for a boat. The general plan also states that in 2002, red algae was a predominant plant species in the waters just south of Point Isabel and along the east side of the North Basin, the same location Dr. Fegan's modeling shows Laci's likely anchor point to be. Evidence at trial showed that the criminalist who examined the pants Laci was wearing when her remains were found noted a, quote, pinkish stain color on them, which tested negative for the presence of blood, causing the criminalist to query whether the staining was from red algae. Dr. Fegan's new Delft 3D modeling shows that Dr. Cheng's opinion that the anchor point for the bodies was precisely where Petitioner fished on December 24th was falsely and scientifically unsound, and that Laci's body was likely put into the bay around the Albany Bulb, a peninsula with multiple land access points. When the defense proffered the theory at trial that someone abducted Laci and held her for a number of days before killing her and putting her body in the bay, the prosecution argued that the defense's theory was, quote, ridiculous, ludicrous. It's not reasonable. It didn't happen, end quote. And that, quote, the only reason those bodies were found is what Dr. Chang testified to, not because of some magical frame-up job, end quote. The prosecution admitted that the MPD, or Modesto Police Department, issued a press release on December 28th broadcasting that petitioner had gone to Berkeley to fish on December 24th, but also argued it was not reasonable to believe that someone had abducted Laci and held her for some time before killing her. But that is precisely what happened. And then it points to, in Claim 1, the study being done about how Connor lived later than they originally thought. The police and media steadily publicized petitioner's fishing location on a near daily basis beginning on December 25th, 2002. On January 5th, 2003, the Modesto Bee published a map showing the precise area police suspected they would find Laci's body. And there's a footnote here that says, quote, in fact, the public and media knew even earlier, by December 26th, that petitioner had gone to Berkeley to fish, as shown by a reporter who asked MPD Chief Roy Waston that day, quote, Chief, was Scott fishing by himself or was he with someone in Berkeley? Quote, the next day, December 27th, the media was already at Berkeley Marina investigating petitioner's alibi. The front page article showed that police believed they would find Laci's body in the waters where petitioner had fished on December 24th, immediately adjacent to the Albany bulb. The new evidence in Claim 1 shows that Laci and Connor were most likely killed on January 1st, 2003, and not before December 28th at the earliest, based on scientific research and studies that were unavailable at the time of trial. The new scientific evidence in Claims 1 and 2 together shows that a person or persons other than petitioner abducted Laci on December 24th, held her for a number of days before killing her, and then put her body in the bay, most likely in the waters around the Albany bulb, which had so many land access points, so the body would eventually be found near the area where petitioner fished, which was widely publicized to shift blame to him. Okay, so to be clear, I mean, this section is essentially saying that the prosecution told the jury that Scott dumped Laci's body from his boat in the exact spot he was fishing, more or less. And then their witness backed it up with his data. They said that the tides carried her remains to where they were found. However, this new expert is, using cutting-edge 3D modeling with actual tide and wind data from that time. And it shows that the bodies couldn't have floated from Scott's fishing spot to the recovery site. And as it said, instead, it looks like it was dumped right from land, right from what's called the Albany bulb, a place where you could drive right up to the edge almost. This, to me, my opinion, this one is a big deal because it doesn't just poke holes in the prosecution's theory, right? It blows it apart. I mean, how many times have we read or have we heard people saying, of course Scott Peterson killed Laci. What, did somebody else who killed her get on their boat, buy a boat or rent a boat to go dump a body? It's ludicrous. But this evidence, it's using real tide data and wind data from that time. That is pretty huge, in my opinion. And it really ties in really well with claim number 1. So if Laci was killed later and her body was placed in the water somewhere that people had, easy access to drive up to, it could explain why she turned up near where she did. And I don't know. I think the judge may see this and find it really compelling as well. Because, again, it's not based on opinion. It's based on actual data that didn't exist back then. Okay, so let's hop into claim number 3. And this one is new evidence. Scent dog handler Eloise Anderson's testimony was false. And it says, scent dog handler Eloise Anderson testified that her scent dog picked up Laci's scent at the Berkeley Marina early the morning on December 28th. The prosecution argued that Anderson's testimony alone was sufficient evidence to convict Petitioner. Quote, if Laci Peterson's scent is at the Berkeley Marina, then he is guilty. I mean, it's as simple as that, end quote. Anderson's testimony and the prosecution's related argument were damning, but they were false. The new scientific evidence set forth in Claim 1 shows that Laci and Connor were alive until at least December 28th, making it extremely unlikely that Anderson's scent dog picked up Laci's scent at the marina early that morning, as the jury was told. The new evidence in Claim 2 shows that Laci's body was most likely put in the water near the Albany bulb, meaning that whoever put her body in the bay likely did so from a land access point without needing to use a boat or a marina at all. As the new evidence set forth in Claim 4 further shows, Laci saw and confronted one or more of the Medina burglars on December 24th after Petitioner had already left home to go to Berkeley Marina, meaning that he could not possibly have taken Laci to Berkeley Marina that day or any day thereafter. Anderson's testimony was therefore false, showing that jurors once again relied on false evidence, extremely prejudicial evidence, to convict him. Okay, so this one's, in plain English, it's pretty clear. The scent dog handler testified her dog picked up Laci's scent at the marina December 28th. The prosecution told the jury it was basically proof that Scott took her there. So again, they're saying back to the other claim, if Laci was still alive on December 28th, as Claim 1 suggests with their new science, of course, the whole dog story falls apart, right? Plus, Claim 2 shows her body was probably not even near the marina at all. So what is my opinion on this? Well, again, I go back to stuff I already know about this case. I don't know if y'all have researched this case as much as I do, but we know that there were witnesses at the marina, and I think more than one of them said there was nothing in the boat, or, they didn't see anything in the boat with Peterson other than a camouflage jacket. I believe what I remember reading in the past was that the scent dog picked up a scent from the wrong launching point. It was actually not the one that Scott used or what he said he had used, so it wasn't right anyway. Well, this one is starting to feel like a domino effect, right? First of all, you might already know that dog scent evidence is often seen as junk science in court, but let's pretend it's not. If claims 1 and 2 are factual, then this testimony wasn't just wrong, it was seriously misleading. And remember, the prosecution said, quote, if Laci's scent is at the marina, Scott is guilty. That's a huge statement to make to a jury. And if it turns out the dog was wrong, that's a massive problem for the state's case. And the judge might have a huge problem with this. But okay, let's dig into the next one. Claim 4. This one is also new evidence that Laci confronted the Medina burglars on December 24th, 2002, contrary to what the jury was told. And it says, the prosecution argued that the Medina burglary did not occur until December 26th, 2 days after Laci was reported missing, and it was therefore unrelated to the crimes in this case. New evidence shows that the Medina's home was burglarized on December 24th and that Laci saw and confronted one or more burglars. This new evidence exonerates Petitioner because the Medina burglary did not occur until after the Medinas had left town for the holidays around 10:30 a.m. on December 24th, which was after Petitioner had left home for the day. Witness M.M. grew up in the airport district and was living there when Laci was reported missing in December of 2002. She knew Stephen Todd, Glenn Pierce, the Tenbrink brothers, Sean, Adam, and Brian, and these are initials coming up, T.L., R.Z., D.M., and others who lived in and frequented the airport district. She lived near Stephen Todd and Glenn Pierce. Shortly after Laci went missing in late December or early January of 2003, M.M. was at a gathering at 335 South Santa Cruz Avenue in the airport district with Jason Nolan, initials RZ, TL, and others, and she heard a discussion about Stephen Todd casing the house across from the Petersons on Covina Avenue. RZ said that Todd needed help getting a car to get items out of the house. RZ and others were saying that a van was used to get the stuff out of the house during the burglary. MM had seen Todd, Pierce, TL, RZ, and others driving around the neighborhood in the orange van shown below, but she was unsure if the burglars used the orange van or another van to carry out the burglary. RZ stated that when he and Todd were committing the burglary, quote, a pregnant lady from across the street came over and confronted them and told them she knew the neighbors weren't home. RZ said that the dog was barking and they told her, go home. It was clear to everyone that the pregnant lady they were talking about was Laci Peterson, and it was also clear that the burglary happened on December 24th. It was this witness's impression that TL also possibly participated in the burglary in some way with Todd and RZ. This new evidence, which petitioner did not receive until January 29th, 2025, so that is literally just months ago, is corroborated by multiple other witnesses who have now come forward and signed sworn declarations with information consistent with Laci seeing and confronting the Medina burglars on December 24th, 2002, as set forth herein. LAPD Lieutenant Adam Berkovici, retired, reviewed the police reports in this case, and he explains in his sworn declaration that MPD's missing person investigation was driven by confirmation bias and failed to comport with even basic police procedures that were standard at that time, including MPD's failure to meaningfully investigate any connection between the three crimes that all occurred within a 24-hour period in close proximity to one another. Laci's disappearance on December 24th, the Medina burglary, and an intentionally set van fire that occurred in the airport district the morning of December 25th, just hours after Laci was reported missing. Lieutenant Berkovici's opinion is supported by other new evidence, which now shows that MPD Detective Stowe, who was assigned the role of investigating the Medina burglary and who publicly announced that the Medina burglars were cleared of any involvement in Laci's disappearance, admitted in a post-conviction interview that police did not investigate the December 24th alibis of Todd and Pierce at all. Detective Stowe not only lied about having verified the December 24th alibis of Todd and Pierce, he obtained at least 4 videotaped witness interviews related to the Medina burglary and kept them in his personal possession for months, instead of booking them into evidence in violation of MPD policies and basic police practices in place at that time. New evidence now links, for the first time, the Medina burglars themselves directly to the burned-out orange former Caltrans van that was torched in the airport district on December 25th because Todd, Pierce, RZ, TL, and their associates were seen driving in the airport district in that same orange van on prior occasions by at least one eyewitness. A mattress found in the back of the burned van appeared to have heavy blood staining on it, and those stains initially tested presumptively positive for the presence of blood shown below. The jury did not hear any evidence related to the burned-out former Caltrans van because, as petitioner learned a decade after he was convicted and sentenced to death, the prosecution suppressed, at the time of the trial, MPD's investigation files and reports into the van fire, including photos, scene diagrams, and other police investigation reports. And a footnote here says, based on the new evidence set forth herein supporting petitioner's claim of innocence, the prosecution should stipulate that additional DNA testing on the stains found on the orange mattress is warranted. If a stipulation is not expeditiously agreed to by the parties, petitioner will file a renewed motion for additional DNA testing of the mattress fabric and other items of evidence for which he previously requested testing but was denied, based on newly discovered evidence that was not available when his DNA motion was litigated in 2024, including evidence recovered from the bay near the recovery sites. Newly discovered evidence further shows that petitioner was unable at trial to show a connection between Laci's disappearance and the Medina burglary because the prosecution intentionally and in bad faith began destroying critical exculpatory evidence related to the Medina burglary just 2 weeks after petitioner was arraigned on capital murder charges. For example, new evidence shows that the prosecution suppressed MPD's March 2003 investigation into a Croton watch that was pawned on December 31st, 2002 by Deanna Renfro, a woman MPD was actively investigating for manufacturing methamphetamine and who police knew associated with individuals in the airport district, including those living at 335 South Santa Cruz, where MM overheard the conversation about Laci confronting the Medina burglars. The pawned Croton watch generally matched the description of the watch Laci was wearing when petitioner saw her, as shown below. At the time of trial, the only evidence the prosecution had turned over to the defense related to Laci's missing Croton watch was a pawn slip, showing that the Croton watch was pawned at the pawn shop in Modesto by Deanna Renfro on December 31st, 2002. Police reports provided to the defense indicated that police conducted no further investigation into that pawned Croton watch in 2003. And a footnote here says, quote, counsel's research shows that Deanna Renfro has family members and social media connections in common with parties associated to the Medina burglary and the America's Most Wanted tip, including individuals living at 335 South Santa Cruz. Discussed infra. New evidence that was not disclosed to the defense at the time of trial shows that police contacted Sam Newman, owner of the pawn shop in Modesto, and told him the Croton watch Renfro pawned was the only one that popped up in the system in the last 6 months, referring to pawn shop records the state maintains and uses to assist law enforcement in searching for stolen property. Newman stated in a filmed interview that he put the watch on hold for the police. Newman further stated that police thought maybe it was Laci Peterson's watch. They just came in and said they're here to pick up the watch, and they took the watch, end quote. Newman stated that he never got the watch back, and if he had, he, quote, would have put it somewhere and framed it, end quote. The jury heard none of this exculpatory evidence at trial about police picking up the pawned Croton watch and was instead left with the impression that police investigated and verified that the Medina burglary did not take place until December 26, 2 days after Laci was reported missing, and that the Croton watch Renfro pawned on December 31st was also investigated and determined not to be Laci's missing Croton. All of this new evidence supports petitioner's claim of innocence. The uncontroverted evidence shows that the Medinas left to go out of town for the holidays on December 24th at around 10:30 a.m. after petitioner had already left home for the day. If Laci saw and confronted the Medina burglars, as the new evidence in Claim 4 now shows, she was alive when petitioner left home for the day, as he has always maintained. This new evidence further undermines the prosecution's entire theory of the case and shows that the prosecution suppressed and destroyed significant exculpatory evidence that would have changed the outcome at trial because it shows petitioner did not kill his family. Whew. So in plain English, just to clarify, the state told the jury the burglary across the street happened 2 days after Laci went missing, so it couldn't have had anything to do with her disappearance, and so the defense wouldn't be able to use it as some sort of a theory. But witnesses have now come forward, one this year, which blew my mind, and they really say the burglary did indeed happened on the 24th. And one of those burglars even admitted that a, quote, pregnant lady confronted them, obviously meaning Laci. And on top of that, there's actual evidence that police never checked the burglars' alibis and then later picked up this Croton watch and physical items and then didn't mark it anywhere and didn't let the defense know. And then I was thinking they didn't even contact family and say like, oh, do you think this is the watch? Like, that's weird. And my opinion here would be that, firstly, I mean, if Laci confronted these burglars after Scott had already left for the warehouse and the marina, which, again, I know a lot of people always argue, what pregnant lady would ever confront people when they're pregnant. For those who don't know, there was a neighbor. He's actually a judge. His name is Judge Cordova. He testified at the trial that Laci had told him she had been confronting transients in the park, kind of like yelling at them to stop camping in the park and stop living in the park. He testified that this concerned him, and he told Laci that that was a dangerous thing to do. And then another neighbor, actually Mrs. Medina, testified that Laci had broken up a fight between transients in the middle of the street a couple of weeks before. And we know that another neighbor that lives on that street, Diane Jackson, told the police days later that she saw shady people on the lawn of the Medina home on Christmas Eve at around 11 a.m. And Lieutenant Aponte had overheard a phone conversation between an inmate and his brother about how one of the burglars got into an altercation with a pregnant lady. So that lieutenant has always claimed he met with detectives, and he even handed over this tape, and those detectives are denying ever meeting with him, which is just weird. And yet the police files, actually the tip sheet shows that he did call 2 weeks into January or something like that when he heard this tape. So that's also weird and shady. And this section is really interesting because it references the recent documentary where Scott Peterson did his first interview in 20 years, which was done by Shireen Anderson. And she went to interview this pawn shop owner. When Sam Newman made this comment about the police just came to pick up the watch, I gasped out loud. I was shocked that he said that. I don't think he doesn't follow the case, so I don't think he realized how significant that comment was and how it would actually become a part of this habeas. It's really interesting to see it all happening and unfolding as we watch this. So anyway, the question really is, where is that watch? Where is the Aponto audio tape? And now we know, we're starting to see, we now have proof the police either purposefully were hiding, losing, or destroying evidence, maybe a combination of all of those things. Either way, it is freaking shady. Not sure what the judge may think or rule on this one, but it's certainly compelling, especially in conjunction with everything else that we are seeing here. Okay, so on to claim number 5, false evidence. This one says Detectives Grogan and Broccini falsely testified there were no credible sightings of Laci. New evidence shows that the prosecution knew there were credible sightings, that MPD's investigation was driven by confirmation bias, and that police intentionally ignored exculpatory eyewitness evidence. Detective Broccini was one of the lead investigators in the case. He described his role as working to eliminate Petitioner as a suspect. He testified that he had received no information that witnesses had reported seeing Laci walking the dog on the morning of December 24th. That testimony was false. It was also highly prejudicial because it gave the jury a false impression that either no such witness had existed, or if they did, no one at MPD believed they were credible enough to pass on to Detective Broccini, the one detective assigned to eliminate Petitioner as a suspect in the case. Recently discovered film footage of an MPD press conference held on December 25, 2002, shows Detective Broccini on camera telling the public, quote, "We have received credible witnesses stating they saw her in La Loma Park." The falsity of Broccini's testimony is also shown by MPD Detective Owen's testimony at Petitioner's preliminary hearing, when he testified that on or about December 27th, he told Broccini that witness Diane Campos saw a woman she believed was Laci walking a golden retriever that was, quote, constantly barking in the park on December 24th. and that 2 white males were harassing her, telling her, quote, "Shut the effing dog up." Owen not only shared Campo's report with Detective Roccini and Detective Grogan, he believes he also shared it with the DAs. MPD's investigators ignored Campo's report and failed to look for or investigate the men she saw harassing Laci in the park, even though neither Campos nor her report was ever discredited, nor was she shown to be an unreliable witness. The prejudice petitioner suffered from Boccini's false testimony that he never received information that neighborhood witnesses reported seeing Laci walking the dog on December 24th was compounded by Detective Grogan's false testimony that petitioner was the last person to see Laci alive. Detective Grogan, like Detective Roccini, was well aware that a number of eyewitnesses reported seeing Laci walking the dog in the neighborhood and park the morning of December 24th. He admitted that police failed to investigate those exculpatory eyewitness reports. As lead investigator, Detective Grogan's testimony gave the jury the false impression that the police had information that justified ignoring those eyewitness reports without investigating them. MPD repeatedly sought the public's assistance in helping law enforcement find Laci, but newly obtained sworn declarations show that when concerned citizens called and reported seeing Laci walking the dog in the neighborhood, those witnesses were systematically ignored and discouraged or dissuaded from filing reports. Eyewitnesses Homer Maldonado, Helen Maldonado, and Tony Freitas have now all stated under oath for the first time that they reported seeing Laci Peterson walking the dog in the La Loma neighborhood the morning of December 24th at times that were after petitioner had already left home for the day. The police ignored all of those reports. Eyewitness Tom Harshman, a former reserve police officer for the Martinez Police Department, states in his 2023 sworn declaration that he saw Laci, or a woman he believed to be Laci, and reported it multiple times to police, who failed to investigate his report. Harshman confirmed that on December 24th or 25th, between 2 and 4 p.m., he saw a pregnant woman with a scared look on her face being pushed into an older white van by 2 men alongside a road just north of La Loma Park, where Laci often walked the dog, and that the woman looked like photos of Laci Peterson he had seen on missing person flyers. Dr. James Lampinen is a distinguished professor and chair of the psychological science at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and a nationally respected expert on eyewitness testimony. Dr. Lampinen undertook a painstaking review of 11 eyewitness accounts ignored by police in this case, witnesses who reported seeing Laci or a woman fitting her description, and prepared a detailed report of his findings. His report and curriculum vitae are attached. As Dr. Lampinen explains, multiple eyewitnesses reported seeing Laci Peterson on the morning of December 24th, walking a dog whose description is generally consistent with a golden retriever, in a cluster of sightings that all occurred within a relatively constrained geographical area of approximately 1/3 square mile of Modesto. Dr. Lampinen determined that most witnesses would have a reasonably good view of the person they saw. Many reported high confidence, and several reported having prior familiarity with Laci Peterson, who would have been fairly distinctive, being more than 7 months pregnant and walking a good-sized dog who itself was distinctive looking. Dr. Lampinen conducted a Bayesian analysis of the eyewitness reports, and in his opinion, when multiple witnesses all make the same identification, the probability that what they reported actually occurred increases substantially, even when any individual witness would not be very convincing. Even when each individual identification would be challenged in isolation, a large number of identifications of the same person becomes very convincing. In Dr. Lampinen's opinion, the fact that several witnesses reported that police did not seriously investigate their eyewitness accounts means the evidence here is consistent with an investigation that was driven by confirmation bias. Quote, confirmation bias refers to the tendency to search for, interpret, and favor information that confirms pre-existing beliefs or hypothesis while disregarding evidence that contradicts them, end quote. Moreover, as retired LAPD Lieutenant Bergovici explains in his declaration, it was standard practice in 2002 and 2003 that among the immediate steps that should be taken in a missing person investigation is determining whether there are potential witnesses. The immediate and surrounding area should be thoroughly searched in a logical and systematic manner to identify and interview potential witnesses, end quote. When witnesses provide conflicting information, the investigating officer should not simply ignore the conflicting information, but, quote, correct and investigate the reasons for conflicting information offered by witnesses and other individuals, end quote, to assess its reliability. The fact that police failed to follow basic police procedures here also indicates the presence of confirmation bias. Petitioner was prejudiced by the false testimony presented by Boccini and Grogan and by the prosecution's failure to correct it, which left the jury with the false impression that the police had good reasons for ignoring those reports, or that they had reasons to believe the eyewitnesses at issue were not credible. The jury was waiting to hear evidence the defense promised to bring in its opening statement that would show Laci was alive and walking the dog in the neighborhood. And in the footnote here it says, juror Steve Cardosi signed a sworn statement saying that, quote, failure to make good on that promise only made me more confident that there were no such witnesses and there was no evidence that Scott didn't do it, end quote. Dr. Lampinen's report provides credible probative evidence that Detective Grogan's authoritative and definitive statement that, quote, Mr. Scott Peterson was the last person to see Laci alive was false. Had the jury heard this new evidence by Dr. Lampinen, Homer and Helen Maldonado, Tony Freitas, and Tom Harshman, the outcome at trial would have been different. It would have raised a reasonable doubt in the mind of at least one juror as to whether Laci was alive on December 24th after Petitioner left home, undermining the prosecution's entire case. Okay, so this section is basically pointing out that, as we had heard before, if you follow this case, several of Laci's neighbors and other people reported seeing a pregnant woman with dark hair walking a dog right along the same sort of path that it was said that's where she normally walked the dog. And again, that would have been after Scott left for that morning. And some of these weren't random people. They lived on her street. I think one person even had the same doctor as her, and they had spoken to her before. So that is significant to me, and it always was. What makes this especially troubling is that the witness who described Laci being harassed by two men in the park. And it just makes me think back to Judge Cordova's testimony, right? Saying that when Laci would go in the park, she would yell at transients. It just makes me wonder. I don't know why all those people in the airport district would be saying that they knew somebody who got into an altercation with Laci that morning or whatever. But at the same time, maybe they confronted her in the park. Maybe they followed her. It really makes you wonder, who was the woman getting screamed at in the park with the lab, and why hasn't she come forward this whole time to say, oh, that was me. I went home afterwards. It's very frustrating to hear that detectives testified to the jury that there were no credible sightings of Laci, but actually, as we know now, they said from the very beginning that there was. So my opinion here is really that it really is alarming that they were discouraged from speaking up about seeing her. But again, my biggest issue with this is that the jury was told something that might not be true, that Scott was the last person to see her alive. But now, especially after learning about that uncovered video that Boccini made that statement that there were credible witnesses, it makes you wonder, why did he change his statement to the jury? I love that they have that video. I don't know who uncovered it, but whoever uncovered it, that's great that they have that. Not sure she's going to think it's as strange as I do. But if she finds this witness credible who studies witnesses, again, it blows apart the state's timeline. To me, it's a textbook example of tunnel vision. Once police locked in on Scott, they ignored anything that didn't fit their theory. Okay, on to the next one. Claim number 6, new evidence. Forensic document examiner. And it says the boat was not a secret. It was a surprise gift to Ron. And it says one of the cornerstones of the prosecution's case was that the petitioner secretly bought a fishing boat without Laci's knowledge because he planned to kill her and use the boat to dispose her body. The prosecution called friends and family to testify that they did not know about the boat purchase to support their secret boat theory. On August 24th, Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, publicly acknowledged for the first time in a filmed interview that petitioner told her he and Laci bought the boat as a surprise gift for Sharon's longtime companion, Ron Gransky, whom Laci considered to be her stepfather. Sharon said, quote, "When I asked him about the boat, I said, 'Why didn't you mention this before?' And he said, quote, 'Oh, I was keeping it a surprise for Ron.'" End quote. Gransky himself testified he was an avid fisherman who often wished he had a boat but couldn't afford one. He had even gone fishing on December 24th, 2002, the same day Laci disappeared. New evidence shows that handwritten notes with phone numbers and information from 2 marine supply stores found in the Peterson home on December 26, 2002, were likely written by Laci, proving that she knew about the boat and was researching the cost of a new anchor for Ron's gift. Dr. Linton Muhammad, a leading forensic handwriting expert, compared the notes to known handwriting examples. In his expert opinion, Laci, quote, probably wrote the note, and petitioner, quote, probably did not. The clear inference is that Laci knew about the boat and was helping gather information to surprise Ron. After learning a 20-inch anchor cost about $60, petitioner decided to make handmade cement anchor for a fraction of the cost, exactly as he told police he had done. Additional evidence shows Peggy O'Donnell, a tenant at the same warehouse complex, saw Laci at Scott's warehouse after the boat was purchased, directly contradicting the claim that Scott bought the boat in secret. Detective Broccini admitted on the stand that he suppressed this information by removing it from his written report, depriving the defense of exculpatory evidence. Detective Grogan later admitted he did the same. This new evidence shows Laci was aware of the boat and that the prosecution knew this, but suppressed it, while falsely presenting to the jury that Scott secretly purchased the boat as part of a premeditated plan to murder his wife and dispose the body. Okay, that one is pretty basic, but in plain English, this section is basically saying the prosecution's big argument was that Scott secretly bought a boat to hide Laci's body and then dump it into the bay. But yeah, new evidence is showing it wasn't a secret. It was actually supposed to be a Christmas surprise gift for Laci's stepfather, and this was always what Scott had said. This is also huge for this case, right? How many times have people always brought up, oh, the boat, he bought the secret boat? It was one of the details that the prosecution kept hammering on, saying that it made Scott look so sneaky and suspicious. And if that turns out to be false, you wonder what else they may have twisted with their theories. It took them a long time, by the way, to find these post-it notes that seemed to be pricing out an anchor. It wasn't known to the original defense. It was kind of buried in boxes and boxes of evidence. When I first heard this was like sometime last year, and I was like, I have to see these post-its. And I looked at them and I'm like, okay, well, Scott could have written this. And then I remembered that I had seen his handwriting elsewhere. There's like police photographs of his office, of him writing numbers down. And I'm no handwriting expert. But one thing I noticed is Scott crosses his sevens. So you could see he writes a 7 and he crosses it. And that's to make it so you don't confuse it for a number 1. I do that. And I can tell you with confidence, I don't ever not do it. It's something that I cannot get away from. And I did see on the Post-its that the 7s are not crossed. To me, Scott did not write those Post-its, and it proves she was placing phone calls about these anchors. It also shows how far the prosecution went to suppress that information and why. When I was researching this case years ago, I stumbled on so many articles written by journalists who were in the courtroom. And if you go back and look at old news articles from I think it's June 2002, you'll see articles about the day that Rocchini was on the stand and when he admitted that he removed something from his report. Essentially, he was trying to remove any data that showed that Laci knew about the boat. So it was the section where he had interviewed Peggy, who said she had used her restroom. I think it was the 23rd or 22nd, whatever it was. He removed that from his report, even though Scott had told Rocchini that Laci was there that day, and then Peggy, backed up his story. And honestly, it was clear back then in the courtroom that something really shady was going on with this case, right? That was live and in person, where everyone was just kind of shocked. Why would a detective delete notes from his own report unless he was trying to control the narrative? It immediately raised red flags, but it's so crazy to look at those articles now, seeing this new habeas and all these other things that have come out. In this section also, I just wanted to point out, it was interesting that they brought up Laci's mom, talking in the new Netflix documentary where she confirms that Scott did tell her, whether it's true or not, he did tell her that it was meant to be a surprise for Ron. That was the first time she ever, I think, publicly stated that. Now, I don't think I've shared this before, but I more recently read Sharon Roach's book for Laci. I have it right here. If you haven't read it, you need to read it if you want to learn more about this case. I wanted to learn more about Laci. I wanted to learn more about Sharon. I wanted to learn their perspective. It's incredibly heartbreaking, but is a very important read. Sharon describes what might have been one of the very last times she ever saw her daughter. She and Ron went to Scott and Laci's house for dinner to watch the season finale of The Sopranos. But this passage floored me at the time, because remember how shady it looked at trial when Rocchini was caught lying on the stand trying to make it seem like Laci had never been to Scott's warehouse to see the boat. Now remember, Scott had purchased this used boat December 9th. And this part in the book that Sharon is talking about would have been December 15th about. So I'm just going to read you this section that I thought was interesting. Chapter 8, pages 74 to 75. At dinner, I said that Ron and I had gone fishing earlier in the morning. Laci's eyes widened. I rarely went fishing with him, so it was news. And it prompted a funny description of me bundled up in a chair beside the river. It was also a perfect opportunity for Scott or Laci to mention that he'd bought a fishing boat a week before. But the subject never came up because A, Laci didn't know, and B, because Scott didn't want us to know. For some reason, Laci mentioned that Scott had told her that the warehouse he rented for work in an industrial part of town was so full he had to step over things to get to his office. I'd never seen the warehouse myself. I didn't even know what it looked like until I saw photos at the preliminary hearing. By that time, I couldn't remember why she had brought it up, but I knew it didn't have anything to do with fishing. In my mind, during this scene, I'm just envisioning Laci's mother, Ron, Scott, and Laci. If this evidence from this claim is true, that Laci knew about the boat and she was helping Scott price out anchors, and all of a sudden her mother comes in and describes how she went fishing with Ron, even though he didn't have a boat, he had a float, and her eyes widened at the story. Now remember, Laci didn't really like fishing. She was excited at this story. And then she immediately launches into talking about the warehouse. Laci was known as Jabberjaws because she always just loved to talk. I'm just envisioning her knowing that the boat is in the warehouse and knowing that there's no room because Scott's having to step over things. And I'm almost imagining her kind of like winking at Scott a little bit, like, great job thinking of this boat purchase. This will be a great gift for them. Almost like tongue-in-cheek joking or kicking him under the table like, oh yeah, Scott said his warehouse is so full. And I love that Sharon wrote about it because to me, if the soul of Laci were looking down at this, and she really did write those post-it notes, the world should know the soul of Laci. And I think it goes hand in hand with the claim in this section. It made me think or understand that she really did know about the boat. And the fact that she brought it up and it seemed like it didn't make any sense. But the fact that her mother wrote it in the book, I don't know. I just found it stunning that she remembered that being so strange. But instead of Scott bringing up the boat, she brought up the warehouse. That little detail, combined with the handwritten notes, really convinces me personally that Laci knew about the boat. So if I had to guess, I think the judge will see this as yet another example of how the jury never got the full picture and how a key piece of the prosecution's story may have been completely wrong. Anyway, back to the petition. Claims 7 through 10. MPD intentionally and in bad faith began destroying physical evidence that had exculpatory value 2 weeks after petitioner was arraigned on capital murder charges and failed to collect exculpatory evidence, also in bad faith, in violation of Trumbetta Youngblood. The official misconduct that came to light in January 2025 as a result of this court's ruling on petitioner's post-conviction discovery motion is jaw-dropping in its brazenness. MPD key investigators and supervisors held a meeting on May 6, 2003, 2 weeks after petitioner was arraigned on capital murder charges, to discuss the discovery to the defense of audio and videotaped evidence, including evidence from the Medina burglary and the burned van. That same day, evidence related to the Medina burglary was marked for destruction, and MPD began destroying the evidence the very next day on May 7th, 2003, including videotaped interviews of the Medina burglars before the defense had an opportunity to review it. Quote, the intentional destruction of evidence in bad faith is a crime in California. Destroying evidence in serious felony cases is a serious issue, and doing so in a capital murder case is inexcusable, end quote. As retired LAPD Lieutenant Bercovici explains, quote, the timing of the destruction of the evidence in the case and the circumstances surrounding the meeting itself are outrageous. The destruction of this evidence cannot be viewed as anything other than the intentional destruction of material evidence in a capital case that was done in bad faith to avoid having to provide the defense with the evidence in discovery as required under Brady, end quote. In January of 2025, petitioner learned for the first time the scope and scale of the prosecution's calculated mendacity and the lengths it was willing to go in its pursuit to convict petitioner. The damning timeline of events that unfolded lays bare the prosecution's calculated plan to intentionally destroy exculpatory evidence related to the Medina burglary, the Croton watch, the van fire, in bad faith, so that the evidence would not have to be turned over to the defense. DDA Rick DeStasio was the lead prosecutor at petitioner's trial. He also negotiated a generous plea deal for Stephen Todd, who was eligible for a third strike felony charge at the time he was arrested for the Medina burglary. The evidence set forth in this petition shows, on February 4, 2003, DDA DeStasio appeared at Stephen Todd's plea hearing after offering Todd a generous plea deal and presented to the court that Todd committed the Medina burglary on December 26, 2002. Todd did not make that representation to the court. The next day, on February 5, 2003, MPD provided the Stanislaus County District Attorney's Office with a copy of videotaped interviews police conducted with Todd and Pierce on January 2nd, 2003, the night of their arrest. On Friday, April 18th, 2003, DNA test results confirmed that the bodies discovered along the East Bay shoreline were those of Laci and Connor Peterson. On Friday, 18th, 2003, MPD arrested Petitioner in San Diego, where he was staying with his family, and drove him back to Modesto, where an angry mob awaited his arrival at Stanislaus County Jail. On Monday, April 21st, 2003, Petitioner was arraigned on capital murder charges, represented by a public defender. On Friday, May 2nd, 2003, Mark Garagos made his first appearance on record as counsel for Petitioner. That same day, Detective Grogan, DAI Bertolato, and DDA DeStacio met to discuss discovery issues. On Tuesday, May 6, 2003, MPD key investigators and supervisors held a meeting to discuss the Medina burglary, the van fire, and the organization of discovery for video and audio tapes, along with other discovery issues, hereafter referred to as the May 6th meeting. The May 6th meeting was attended by MPD Captain Greg Savelli, Lieutenant Aja, Sergeant Mike Czar, Detective Rudy Scoltetti, Detective Al Bercini, Detective John Bueller, and Grogan. At the May 6th meeting, Detective Stowe, who led the investigation into the Medina burglary and who later admitted he did not investigate the alibis of Todd and Pierce for December 24th at all, attended the meeting to brief investigators on the Medina burglary and investigation of the van initially believed to be associated with the burglary. That same day, on May 6th, the videotaped interviews police conducted with Todd and Pierce on January 2nd, 2003, the night of their arrest, and the Medina safe recovered from the home of Todd and Pierce where they were arrested, were all marked for destruction. On May 7th, 2003, the very next day, the January 2nd videotaped interviews of Todd and Pierce were destroyed before the defense had an opportunity to request them and review them. Petitioner discovered, as recently as this year, 2025, that the prosecution destroyed other evidence related to this case, but has not yet learned the full extent of what other evidence was destroyed following the May 6th meeting or at any other time. On May 27, 2003, the Medina safe was destroyed before the defense had an opportunity to have it forensically examined. September 2003, when defense counsel was pressuring the Stanislaus County District Attorney's Office to turn over the January 2nd videotaped interviews of Todd and Pierce prior to the preliminary hearing, the SCDAO blocked the defense discovery requests based on discussions with DDA DeStacio and DDA Harris because of their, quote, false accusations and unprofessional conduct. The prosecution did not inform the defense that the January 2nd videotaped interviews with Todd and Pierce were destroyed months earlier, which is powerful evidence that the evidence was not destroyed pursuant to policy and was instead destroyed so it would not have to be turned over to the defense. Petitioner only learned that MPD began intentionally destroying evidence related to the Medina burglary because Judge Hill ordered the prosecution to turn over that evidence over 22 years after it should have been given to the defense at the time of trial. In addition, Petitioner learned for the first time at a 2024 hearing before this court that the prosecution had also destroyed the van itself, based on a representation by Dave Harris to that effect, which is also not supported or explained by anything in the record. Retired LAPD Lieutenant Bercovici, who is an expert in police procedures and practices, describes the level of bad faith present in this case as, quote, outrageous, and points out in his declaration that the destruction of evidence is a crime in California. Quote, "The intentional destruction of evidence in bad faith is a crime in California. Destroying evidence in serious felony cases is a serious issue, and doing so in a capital murder case is inexcusable in his opinion. There is no justification for such misconduct." End quote. What is now clear, based on the prosecution's own records, is that 2 weeks after Petitioner was arraigned on capital murder charges, MPD's key investigators and supervisors met and made a conscious and intentional decision to begin destroying evidence related to the Medina burglary before the defense had an opportunity to request and review that evidence, and then covered up the fact that they destroyed that evidence. And there's something really important down here that I want to highlight in the footnote that says, quote, "Both Fladiger and Harris," which were prosecutors, "were brought out of retirement and paid $95,000 per year on top of their pensions for the sole purpose of defending the conviction in this case, and both objected to all of Petitioner's post-conviction discovery requests." And then it cites where they could find this proof in the exhibits. The exculpatory nature of this and other suppressed evidence was plain on its face and is discussed in detail infra. It is difficult to imagine a clearer illustration of official animus and bad faith. Authorities may not destroy evidence, quote, "in a calculated effort to circumvent the disclosure requirements established by Brady versus Maryland and its progeny," end quote. On this record, Petitioner alleges that the physical evidence MPD destroyed includes, at a minimum, 1. The January 2nd, 2003 videotaped police interviews MPD conducted with Todd and Pierce at the police station following their arrest, wherein they, quote, "clarified earlier statements made regarding the burglary, including when and how it occurred." 2. The Medina safe, recovered from the home of Todd and Pierce when they were arrested, and destroyed before it was forensically examined for evidence of others who may have handled the safe and assisted with the burglary. 3. The audio-taped recordings of Sean Tenbring's phone calls with his brother and mother regarding Laci confronting Todd during the burglary and or contents. And this is a Ponte report. And 4. The Croton watch police collected from the pawn shop and MPD's related investigation. In addition, MPD admitted it intentionally failed to collect exculpatory evidence, which Petitioner alleges was done in bad faith, when it intentionally ignored the multiple eyewitness reports that showed Laci was alive and walking the dog in the neighborhood, evidence that would have exonerated Petitioner. Petitioner's conviction must be overturned based on these Trombetta Youngblood claims as set forth infra. So to summarize, again, it's pretty clear, 2 weeks after Scott was formally charged, police and prosecutors held a meeting where they decided to start destroying all of this evidence that was connected to the burglary. The videotaped interviews, that's crazy. The defense kept asking over the years for this, and they just kept saying it didn't exist. Well, now we know it was marked for destruction. Why would the prosecution risk committing a crime in this case? So my opinion on this one, this to me is wild. This is hard evidence of a Brady violation. And I have to tell you, of all the claims, this one is clearly the worst, and it is disgusting. I've actually seen the LAIP's exhibits on it, and honestly, it's pretty clear. Supervisors had a meeting and the paperwork was marked for destruction and it has the date stamp on it. So I don't know how they get out of this one. To me, it feels blatantly corrupt and it is obviously illegal. Think about it. If police were confident Scott was guilty, why destroy anything? If your case is solid, wouldn't you want every single piece of evidence to pack you up? The fact that they rushed to cover it up screams that something was wrong and there was a cover-up. If this were one isolated incident, maybe I could see how they could argue that it was just a mistake, but there's far too much of this behavior and this pattern going on in this case for that to hold any water. And if that weren't bad enough, very same prosecutor's office earlier this year had to pay $22.5 million in the Frank Carson case for almost identical reasons. That is a pattern, especially considering Birgit Flatiger and Dave Harris were directly involved on both of those cases. Flat out with this one, I don't see how the judge ignores this one. I think it's really, really bad. And remember, back in October, she herself ordered this evidence, calling it, quote, potentially exculpatory, only to learn almost a year later that through the investigation, LAIP discovered it was deliberately destroyed after a meeting about the Peterson case. Can't see how she ignores this one. Okay, on to Claim 11. Due process. The prosecution suppressed exculpatory evidence in violation to Brady. And it says the prosecution suppressed evidence favorable to petitioner when it destroyed the physical evidence addressed in claims 7 through 9, intentionally failed to collect exculpatory evidence as addressed in claim 10, and further suppressed one MPD's investigation into CDCR Correctional Lieutenant Aponte's report that inmate Sean Tenbrink discussed while on a recorded phone call with his brother, Adam Tenbrink, that Laci saw Todd committing the burglary. 2, the fact that Detective Stowe lied about verifying alibis of Todd and Pierce, and that he, in fact, failed to investigate their alibis before clearing them of any involvement in Laci's disappearance. MPD interviews with Susan Medina and Stephen Todd, during which it was discussed that Todd used the Medina's home phone to make phone calls to his associates during the burglary. 4. MPD's complete investigation into the orange van fire that happened on December 25th. 5. MPD's 2003 investigation into the Croton watch pawned by Renfro on December 31st. 6. MPD's interview with James Romano that law enforcement conducted while petitioner's trial was underway, beginning in the summer of 2004. 7. Detective Grogan and Detective Broccini's suppression of evidence showing that Laci visited petitioner's warehouse where the boat was stored after the Petersons bought the boat. 8. MPD's interview with Susan and Rudy Medina, during which the Medinas explained to police that the burglary had to have occurred on December 24th based on their outgoing mail situation. New evidence, including Birgit Flatiger's sworn 2023 deposition testimony in the case involving Frank Carson and his co-defendants, reveals that the SCDAO had a long-standing practice of suppressing exculpatory evidence in serious felony cases, including special circumstance cases, included recorded witness interviews with critical material witnesses in violation of Brady and its progeny. Here, the prosecution systematically suppressed and destroyed virtually every shred of exculpatory evidence known to police and which the defense needed to support its third-party culpability defense at trial. That misconduct violated petitioner's constitutional right to due process and a fair trial. As a result, the defense was unable to show the jury at trial that these crimes were committed by someone other than petitioner. So to summarize, prosecutors are legally required to turn over any evidence that could help the defense. We know they didn't just fail to turn it over, and it's looking like a pattern. They actually hid it or destroyed it. Evidence tying the burglars to the crime, the witness statements about Laci being alive later, proof that Laci knew about the boat, reports about the orange van, blah, blah, blah. As for my opinion on this piece, first of all, I have never seen Birgit Flatiger's sworn declaration about what I just read, and I'm going to seek it out because I really would love to see what she had to say. But in my opinion on this part, again, Brady violations are no small issue. They're a huge deal. They go right to the heart of a fair trial. So if the judge believes this and thinks this is a valid argument, it's almost automatic that Scott gets a new trial. And given how many pieces of evidence we're talking about here, it's really hard to see this as anything but deliberate at this point. But the question for me is like, why? Why? Don't understand that. Okay, on to claim number 12, prosecutorial misconduct. The prosecution presented false argument to the jury. And it says, every aspect of the prosecution's theory as to how the crimes in this case were committed has now been shown to be false. The new evidence set forth in this petition shows that the prosecution's entire theory of the case was wrong. As such, the prosecution's entire closing argument was false, unsupported by the evidence as it is now known, and prejudicial to petitioner. In addition, with respect to the prosecution's argument that petitioner used the boat cover to hide his wife's body while driving to the marina, that damning argument misrepresented the evidence at trial and was highly prejudicial to petitioner. There was no evidence showing that the boat cover had ever been used at all. In 2023, counsel visited the courthouse exhibit room to examine and photograph the condition of the boat cover. As the photographs below illustrate, the nylon ties on the boat cover are in mint condition, apparently never used, with no sign of use, such as stretching, twisting, or any other sign of wear and tear. The nylon loops that would have been used to secure the boat cover to the boat remain in pristine condition and do not appear to have been used at all. They certainly do not reflect the wear and tear they would have sustained if they were holding the boat cover down during a 90-mile drive from Modesto to Berkeley Marina, driving at highway speeds. And by the way, they would have been there and back, so it would have been more than 90. Anyway, there were no bungee cords found anywhere during the searches of petitioner's home and warehouse that were suitable to use with the boat cover. In addition, the boat cover was forensically and exhaustively tested, and there was no evidence found that the cover had been, quote, stuffed around Laci's body. 169 sample cuttings from stains that were observed on the boat cover were forensically examined for the presence of blood, urine, and feces, and no evidence was found linking Laci Peterson or anyone else to the boat cover. The prosecution's misrepresentation of the boat cover evidence violated petitioner's right to due process and was one more instance of the many violations that denied him a fair trial. The prosecution similarly misrepresented the evidence related to the pants Laci was wearing when her remains were recovered. Desperate to shore up its weak and circumstantial case, the prosecution told the jury in the opening statement the khaki pants Laci wore to her sister Amy's hair salon on December 23rd were the same pants found on her body when her remains were recovered. That argument was damning because it supported the prosecution's initial theory that Laci was killed on December 23rd. But that argument was demonstrably false, and it misrepresented the evidence at trial. The prosecution knew that Amy Rocha had searched Laci's closet and located and identified the outfit Laci wore to Amy's salon on December 23rd. Amy Rocha had already found in Laci's closet and clothes hamper the, quote, whole outfit, end quote, that Laci had worn on December 23rd before Laci's remains were recovered. Detective Grogan nevertheless interviewed Amy again after Laci's remains were found and asked her to select the pants Laci was wearing on December 23rd from a pants lineup. And it was like a photograph. Unbeknownst to Amy, the pants on Laci's body were in photo number 3. Amy reviewed the pants lineup and told Detective Grogan the pants in number 3, the pants found on Laci's remains, were definitely not the same pants she wore to the salon on December 23rd. The pants Amy had previously identified were not included in the lineup. The prosecution nevertheless falsely argued to the jury in closing arguments that Laci was, quote, wearing those pants I showed you, end quote, when her remains were found, referring to the pants Laci had worn when she went to the salon on December 23rd. Detective Grogan invested substantial time and effort trying to establish that the pants were the same so the prosecution could argue petitioner killed his wife the night of December 23rd. But Detective Grogan's effort failed because they were not the same pants, as Amy Rocha repeatedly told him. Okay, to summarize, in their final statements to the jury, you heard what it said. Prosecutors made the bold claims that weren't backed by evidence, saying that, Scott used this boat cover to hide Laci's body, even though it forensically showed no trace of blood, no bodily fluids, and the loops weren't even, they were still in mint condition, showing that there was no fraying or anything, or even like little marks on them or anything like that. And they claimed that Laci wore this very same pants on December 23rd, even though her sister had already identified them. To me, this is the kind of stuff that makes you just shake your head. Closing arguments are supposed to be based on facts. You can't imagine what the judge is thinking at this point reading all this. She can't be happy. As I said before, it's getting worse and worse with each claim. And as we know, the prosecution team kind of has a track record of this kind of thing. But we'll see what she says. Let's move on to claim number 13. It's cumulative error. And it says, in some cases, no individual error is prejudicial enough to warrant relief. But when there are a number of constitutional or statutory violations, the court will conclude that the errors, cumulatively, undermine confidence in the conviction and warrant relief. That is certainly the case here. And that's pretty basic. They're saying that essentially, even if just one of these on their own are not enough, this is clearly a disaster here. Think of it like this. One claim mistake might be an accident, but dozens of them, clearly habitual and a broken system. And I almost see this claim as like sort of an extra little added safety net for, that the team of lawyers is putting in here. Because even if the judge has doubts about any one of the claims, she can read this and say, yes, certainly, there's too many errors here to ignore. And honestly, looking at all of this, it does really seem that she could rule that way. We'll see. Let's go on to claim number 14, and that is actual innocence. Petitioner has presented new evidence that undermines the prosecution's entire circumstantial case against him and supports his claim of innocence. New scientific and medical research establishes that Laci and Connor were not killed on December 23rd or 24th, but were alive until at least December 28th, and were most likely killed on January 1st, 2003, at a time Petitioner could not possibly have been responsible. Scientific evidence further shows Laci's body was not put into the bay where Petitioner fished, as the jury was told, but instead the waters around the Albany bulb. Dr. Chang's testimony, relied on by the jury, is directly refuted by Dr. Fegan's advanced 3D modeling. This evidence also undermines the false testimony by Eloise Anderson, who claimed her scent dog picked up Laci's scent at Berkeley Marina on the morning of December 28th, a date when Laci was likely still alive. New evidence shows that Laci saw and confronted the Medina burglars on December 24th after Petitioner had left home, proving that he could not have killed her or Connor. Additional evidence now links the burglars to an orange van, intentionally set on fire the morning after Laci was reported missing. Evidence also shows that detectives Grogan and Broccini falsely testified there were no credible sightings of Laci walking the dog, and that the police intentionally failed to investigate witnesses due to confirmation bias and tunnel vision. Further, evidence shows the prosecution's theory that Petitioner secretly bought a fishing boat to murder his wife and unborn son was baseless and fabricated to support a weak case. Finally, new evidence reveals the prosecution systematically suppressed or destroyed nearly every piece of exculpatory evidence the defense needed to present a third-party culpability defense. Collectively, this new evidence strongly supports Petitioner's claims, including his claim of actual innocence. So, this claim is essentially saying all of the new evidence paints a very different picture here. Laci and Connor still being alive after December 24th. Burglars had motive and opportunity. Police and prosecutors actively hid or destroyed evidence pointing away from Scott. And my thought here, this is just the final punch. If the judge believes Scott has proven actual innocence, she can vacate his conviction completely. Personally, if I had to guess, I would say she definitely wouldn't go that far at this point, so early, but we shall see. Okay, so those are all of the claims from Scott Peterson's recently filed habeas petition. That's as deep as I'm going to go right now, but I am planning on going more deeply to examine each claim, show some of the declarations and exhibits that went along with all of this, one episode at a time, reading directly from the petition and the 49 exhibits, and maybe adding my commentary or what I might know. outside of what's presented. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to have two different playlists because I've already recorded Scott's declaration, which was like a 100-page plus, document. That's going to be like a 6 or an 8-part series on its own. And then with this 14 claims in depth, it's going to be many episodes. So in the coming weeks, you're going to hear me reading more in depth and directly from the forensic experts, detectives, eyewitnesses. You're going to see how this case may not be what the public has been led to believe. So as for what's coming up next for this actual case, again, this petition was just filed with San Mateo County Court August 4th, and the court has 60 days to respond, which puts the deadline somewhere around October 3rd, like early October. So we should be hearing something very soon, which is why I kind of rushed to get this out. Judge Hill, I believe, was supposed to preside in this again. So she'll have 3 options here. She can either deny some or all of the claims outright, she can request additional briefing, or she can issue an order to show cause, which would lead to a full evidentiary hearing, and that would be a huge step toward a possible new trial. So if I had a guess, I'd like to think that she'd at least order a hearing. Even that alone would be massive progress for this case if you think back to what everyone thought about this case for so many years. But honestly, some of this evidence, especially the proof of the evidence destruction, it points to what could be criminal activity by the prosecution. And that lines up perfectly with what just happened back in April with the massive prosecutorial lawsuit settlement in the Carson case. And this judge has heard about it, obviously. But whatever the judge decides, I will be working hard to release episodes that go deeper into each one of the claims one by one. So if you want to follow along step by step, please make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss a single update. If this video hasn't already, further videos just might change everything you thought you knew about this case. But I just don't want to be the only one speaking here. I want to hear from you. Do you think this is just another desperate attempt by Peterson to talk his way out of trouble? Or do you feel like you've seen enough evidence to believe this case may really have been botched or corrupted from the very start? And what do you think that Judge Hill is going to decide on these claims? Let me know what you all think in the comment section down below, but that's going to be it for me today. For those new to my channel, my name is Tara Marie, and this has been an episode of True Crime Matters with Tara Marie. If you have gotten any use out of this video, please take a second to subscribe so we don't lose each other. It costs nothing, and it would mean so much to me to have your support along the way. As always, thank you so much for watching. Be careful out there.